Shavua Tov. Thanks for tuning in. We're going to continue this evening with Hilchot Beit HaBechira, the laws of the chosen house, the second chapter. We did the first chapter last week. Sorry about that. So this week we have a few more visual aids. So for the benefit of those joining us at home, we have the text here, credit to Machon Shilo, of the Hilchot we're studying. Here other such references and a nice handy map thanks to Chabad, which is pretty accurate. I mean, there's no reason for it to be inaccurate. I appreciate the fact that it's here. I did a simple Google search for the layout of the Second Temple before, and I found that most of the resources that have, let's say, a map like this, are put up by, interestingly enough, non-Jewish groups, usually Christian groups. Recently, there was some talk about our relationship with Christian groups. I am not a big fan of Christianity or cooperation or even dialogue with Christianity. I don't think that if I had a synagogue in the States, I would host any pastor. But then again, I also wouldn't have such opposition, vociferous opposition to anybody who chose to do so. I understand their side. I remember Rabbi Rabinovich himself had some pretty lenient views. I myself don't subscribe to those views, but I can understand why people would follow such views. Great men have held such views, and whatever. They're much more entitled than I am to my opinion. So here we go with these halachot. The Rambam is going to describe now the layout of the altar in the temple, specifically the way it was in the Second Temple, because that's apparently how it's supposed to be in the future also. We'll see those in detail. Basically, it does not fit the way that the altar was built in the first temple, and it does not fit especially that which was built in the Mishkan. It's a good question, what was in Machon Shilo? Apparently, it's explicit verses that the original altar, which was much smaller, although it had the same height apparently, the original altar that was built in the time of Moses, which was basically a wooden altar overlaid with bronze and filled with dirt, was brought back into service in the times of Nov and Givon, whereas perhaps in Shiloh they were using something similar to that which they used in the first temple, although perhaps smaller. So this chapter is about the altar. The next chapter is about the menorah, and the Midrash famously says that Bezalel challenged Moses about his plans. The first thing that they were told to make was the Ark of the Covenant, and Bezalel said, "Yeah, but you first have to have where to put it. So you should start with the structure of the tabernacle first." And Moses said, "Yeah, you must have gotten some. You must be in on certain private information. That's indeed the way you're supposed to do it." I would have expected Rambam to start with the actual structure of the temple edifice, and perhaps the courtyards, but he does not do that because. Technically speaking, as we'll see later, the barest minimum necessary for the reinitiating the temple service throughout history, and especially in our times and previously in history, is by first creating a new altar. All we need is an altar, he's going to say. Everything is technically there, even though the walls of the courtyards aren't there, the temple edifice is not there, nothing is properly demarcated. It does not matter. We could still build an altar tomorrow morning and begin the temple service as long as we have a proper Kohen who's properly dressed. And the next chapter is dedicated to the menorah of all things. The menorah has to be inside, once again, the main temple structure, but that's not necessary. It so happens that just like we could begin the temple service tomorrow by rebuilding an altar and continuing from there, while they're constructing the temple and the other vessels, we could have the sacrifices going. So too, the next thing to do is have the menorah. You could light the menorah, you just have to put it somewhere and light it. And Maimonides is going to rule that indeed that's the case. He says that you could take the menorah out of the actual temple and even give it to an ordinary Israelite to light in the temple courtyard, and then the priests put it back in its place. And technically speaking, if there's no one else who could do such a thing, so perhaps maybe even Israelites or Levites can move the menorah back to its place. But in our days also, this is something that's quite doable. We could have a sacrifice tomorrow, even when the temple is barely under construction, even when they're just getting the supplies ready. And we could then light the menorah and just place it where it's supposed to be. That would not be a problem. That would be the fulfillment of the commandment. And these two mitzvahs are the first things that we could do. And that's the way it was in history. For example, it says over here in the book of Ezra, it says when the Jewish people were allowed back by King Cyrus, and they were given a mandate to rebuild the temple. So there's a list here of those who came up in the first wave. And it says once they got there, here's a list of the money they had, number of horses, people. It says that of the Kohanim and the Levites and of the regular people and those who are in charge of the singing, the gatekeepers, these are types of Levites, and the Nethinim, as I'll explain. The Nethinim were the descendants of the Gibeonites who tricked Joshua into a peace treaty, or actually a treaty of surrender. They were the only Canaanites who did such a thing. So they were made to be eternal servants of the temple, which sort of was to their benefit. They stayed with the Jewish people, even though they're considered of blemished lineage. We see that they persisted among the Jewish people for centuries and millennia. So it was to their benefit. And it says, V'chol Yisrael Bar-Hayim, and the rest of the Israelites were back in their cities, which is an amazing thing. The seventh month came, the children of Israel were in the cities, and then the people assembled as one man to Jerusalem. This is the first high priest of the Second Temple era, Yoshua ben Yosadok, who was a grandson of the previous Kohen Gadol in the end of the First Temple. Zerubbabel ben Shealtiel, Zerubbabel, who was also a great-grandchild, Zerubbabel ben Shealtiel, no, ben Asir. So that means he was also a great-grandson of King Yehoiachin, one of the last kings of Judah, whose uncle was the last king. His uncle Tzidkiah was the last king. Yehoiachin was a young man taken into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar almost a decade before the destruction of the First Temple. He had only reigned for a few months, and according the legend has it that his own son was born in jail when he was imprisoned by Nebuchadnezzar. And him and his brethren, Vayivnueth Mizbach Elokei Yisrael L'Ha'alot Alao Oloth Kakathu B'Thirath Moshe Ishu Elohim, and they built the altar of the God of Israel in order to raise upon it Oloth, elevation offerings. Used to be translated as the burnt offerings, and before the Holocaust, they used to call this the Holocaust. Holocaust just means entirely burnt. But after the Holocaust, and Elie Wiesel, I think, coined that term, they stopped, that became the word now. Kakathuv b'thirath Moshe ish Elohim, as is written in the Torah of Moses, the man of God. So it says the first thing they were charged to build the temple. So they got together and they built the altar, and they started the temple service right thereon. They put the Mizbeach, they set it up right away, and they also were intimidated by the Amei HaRasoth, the local proto-Palestinians, Samaritans, Ammonites, Moabites, and even Arabs. It says a prominent figure in the opposition to the rebuilding of the temple was Geshem or Gashmu Ha'aravi, the Arab. And it says, Wailu allow Oloth Hashem, Oloth Laboker Arev. They brought elevation offerings to the Lord, both Oloth in the morning and the evening. That refers to the morning Tamid and the afternoon Tamid. And it says they even celebrate Sukkoth over here. They did everything the right way. And then they continued. They continued the Olath Tamid, the Chodashim, those are the Musafim, Chol Moedei Hashem, and they also brought their own voluntary offerings. And this started on the first day of the seventh month, what you and I know as Rosh Hashanah. And that's when they started the service. But the temple of God had not even been founded. They haven't even put down the foundations of this new temple. So they gave money to these hewers of stone. The charashim are the people who prepare the materials, usually the wood. Food, drink, and oil, for the Sidonians and the Tyrians. Remember, they're the ones who provided the materials for the first temple. To bring cedar wood from the Lebanon by the way of the sea to Jaffa, as they had been authorized by King Cyrus of Persia. So this echoes the way Solomon obtained the cedars also for the first temple. And then it says Uvashana Shenith Levo Amel Bethel Him Yerushalayim, in their second year from when they arrived at the house of God, Jerusalem, Lachodesh Hasheni, which would be ER, the second month. Heichelu Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel Yeshua ben Sodak, Ushara Chahema Kohanim Alim, and the rest of their brethren, the Kohanim and Levim. In this case, Zerubbabel, the Davidic ruler of the Jews, because all said it wasn't called king, he's called Paha, which is the Persian word back then for governor or ruler, who's subservient to the king. In this case, he's first, and Yehoshua ben Yosadak, the hereditary high priest, is second. Why? Because over here, earlier, when it talks about the initiation of the temple service, the rebuilding of the altar, that's the purview of the Kohanim. Only Kohanim can work on the altar. So, and by work, I mean they could, not the construction, I mean serve on the altar. So the Kohen takes precedence. But here, with the construction of the temple, that's the Davidian's job. So Zerubbabel goes first. And all those who came back from captivity to Jerusalem, they set up the Levites of 20 years of age and above in order to get going with the work of the house of the Lord. And it says here, there's a list of the people who did there, and they started putting down the temple. And that's what it says, also a classic line over here, that when they started doing this, there was a big celebration. It says, and the builders started founding. They laid the foundations for the temple of God. So it says the Kohanim there were in their vestments and they're blowing on the trumpets, and the Leviim of the descendants of Asaph were on the tambourines or the cymbals to praise the Lord, and using, by the way, the text that David HaMelech himself had set aside. That's the Tehillim. And they answered. They were saying the Hallel to Hashem, Kili Olam Chasto. And they made a great noise, Al Husad Beit Hashem, because the house of God had been established or had been founded. And then it classically says here that they couldn't tell. There were some old timers there who remembered the first temple. Habayit Harishon Biosto, they had seen it. Zabayit Benhem Bochim Bekol Gadol. They were crying. To them, it was a big disappointment, and they didn't know, who was louder, the old timers crying, or the new generation who were celebrating. That made a loud noise. That is also when the trouble starts. And let's go back to Maccabean times also. The Maccabees, we celebrate Chanukath Mizbeach in their own accounts. The first thing that they tried to do was repair the altar. First thing, get to the altar, rebuild the altar. They had to take apart the altar that was there. It had been contaminated with alien service, and they built a new altar. And also what they could do right away was light the menorah. And even there, they didn't have a menorah. They made a makeshift menorah, which we're going to see. How do you make a makeshift menorah? Well, that's the first thing you do. The first and most important thing is to get the altar going. And the next thing to do is light the menorah. Even if the temple is not standing, you can't do the other forms of service. And that's a very important thing in our day, because like I said, tomorrow morning, God willing, we should merit to see this. And there's no halachic technicality that is preventing this from happening. And here we go. Also, just the layout, we mentioned this before. We didn't see this inside. Oh, okay, that's quite good. This is the Kodesh. We described it. Over here is where the menorah is supposed to be. That's the west. Remember, west is to the left. In the east, that's where they have the Shulchan. And over here, more toward the center, is the incense altar made out of gold. There was no ulam in the Mishkan. And it says here, additional tables, these were service tables. These were not actually for sacrifice. That is, it was a convenience for the Kohanim who had to do things. They had to put things here sometimes, but these were not mandated by Torah law. This room doesn't even exist technically by Torah law. Let's see what other details we should mention here. Oh yeah, also notice that the menorah and the Mizbeach themselves were quite far into the Kodesh, and the western side. West is up in this case. They were toward the western side of the room, right before the Kodesh Kodashim. Now let's get back to the text itself. Like I said last week, I prefer to use the Korean edition because it's a good size, and I can write my notes in there. Let's see if we're getting questions from anybody. No questions. Okay. It's going to be hard for me to see questions while we're doing this. So, like I said, their patience is welcome. Let's see the outline of the Mizbeach. It says here, HaMizbeach Mekomo Mechuan Bioter. The place of the altar is very exact. We're not allowed to move it from its place ever. Shneamar Wazeh Mizbeach Le'olal Yisrael. This is the altar for the burnt offering for Israel. That's where Israelites have to do their sacrifice, which, like we're going to see, for Gentiles, technically speaking, Gentiles who want to serve the true God have no obligation whatsoever to worship in Jerusalem or on the Temple Mount. They can build an altar to God wherever they please, as long as it's to God, not to some non-God. Uvamikdash ne'kad Yitzchak Avinu. It happens to be that in the Mikdash, what in the temple? No, in the place of the temple. But once again, as we said many times before, Maimonides equates the whole area of the temple, both the entire area, the Temple Mount, and the temple, even when it's not standing with the temple. As long as the entire Temple Mount is the temple forever, even if there's no temple, and even if it's not exactly within the strictly defined temple. At this temple, Ne'akad Yitzchak Avinu, Shneamar Welech Lecha Al Eretz HaMoriah. We know that by tradition that the binding of Isaac took place where the temple would be eventually built, because it says that Abraham was commanded to go bring his son to the land of Moriah. When Amar, it's also said, and this, as they point out, is not an exact pasuk. Rambam here combines pieces of two psukim. There's Melachim and Divrei Yom here. Even Shlomo Abayith, Bahar Moriah. The exact psukim, thanks to Korean, they tell us is really, it says even Shlomo Abayith Vaychalehu. He had built the temple and he completed it. And the second verse is Vayachel Shlomo Lilov Beit Hashem. Shlomo began to build the temple of the Lord, Yerushalayim Bahar Moriah, in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. Umasoreth Biav Hakol. Sha'amakom Shebana Bo Davidu Shlomo Amizbeach Begoran Arauna. It's another well-known tradition that the place where David built, and says Shlomo necessarily there, it means David built a makeshift altar at the end to stave off the plague in the threshing floor of Arauna, sometimes written Ornan, or other things, or Orna. That's the same place where Abraham built his altar and bound Isaac upon it. That's the place where Noah also built an altar when he left the ark. It's also the same place where Cain and Abel brought their sacrifices. And that's the place where Adam, the first man, when he was created, brought sacrifice. That's also where he was created, by the way. That's where the material was taken, the dirt, from the place of the altar. Amru Chachamim, Adam mimakom kapratho nivra. Man was created from the place of his atonement. Now, this is another piece of history. I was alluding to this earlier. Before Rambam even talked about technicals of building a temple, he gives a little bit of the history of where the temple had stood. He talks about the one in the desert, Gilgal, Nov, Shiloh, Givon, ultimately Jerusalem, not in that order. The real order is Gilgal, Shiloh, Nov, Givon, Jerusalem. There's a very important point here. Why is he bringing us history? He's also going to describe the place of the Holy of Holies. This is because you don't want to change it. The place really matters. And there's always been a few times in history where there's been a suggestion, okay, so do something else. Maybe it doesn't have to be that way. Sometimes it's misguided, but well-meaning Jews. Remember, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Doesn't matter their intentions. They're extremely misguided. And sometimes it's even worse. It comes from our enemies within, mistaken enemies within, and Zadim, intentional enemies without, who try to get us to go somewhere else. The Jewish people don't belong in the land of Israel, and if they belong in the land of Israel, it should be limited. They should not have access to certain places. No. The temple is strictly in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, and the place of the altar is a very exact place. It is no compromise. And the place of the Holy of Holies itself, that's also, even if the Ark of the Covenant is not there, like we saw in previous Shiurim, the place of the Holy of Holies is non-negotiable. All these places are critical and uncompromisable. Next, Midothim Mizbeach Mechuvanot Harbe. The actual dimensions of the Mizbeach are also very exact. With Suratho Yudua Ish Me Ish. And its actual shape, exact structure, is something that's known also positive tradition, man-to-man tradition. Umizbeach shebanu b'nei hagolah, the altar that the b'nei hagolah built. B'nei hagolah is an expression he takes from the Bible. Also, that means those who came back from the Babylonian captivity. Ke'ein mizbeach she'athi lihibanot asuhu. They built it in the manner that the altar that is supposed to be built in the future. You cannot add to its midah, its measurements, or to subtract from it in any way. That's interesting. He's basically saying once they built the second temple altar, that's the way it's going to stay, even though previously in history the altar had been enlarged quite a few times. Three prophets ascended with them from the from the captivity, or from the exile in Babylon. One of them testified as to the place of the altar. And another one testified to them concerning its dimensions. And the other one testified. Tradition, remember, it's interesting. They were prophets, but what they said was not on the authority of prophecy. It was on the authority of tradition, which is even stronger sometimes. He says he testified that they could offer sacrifice on this altar. Okay, critical point. Ram's going to mention this again. Even if the temple is not standing, even if there is no temple, it's still a mikdash, and you could start the sacrificial service as we saw. The three prophets, they're generally identified with Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Zechariah and Haggai have their own books, and there they give dates. They were around at the time of the rebuilding of the temple. Haggai's book is quite shorter. He seems he was active, not as much as Zechariah, but they were there. It's a little bit more of a stretch to say Malachi was there. That which is described in his book seems to be, this could be another shiur for some later time, seems to be mostly after the completion of the second temple. That's what he's talking about, but he was there regardless, and each of them testified as to one of these aspects. Mizbeach she'asa Moshe, v'she'asa Shlomo, v'she'asu b'nei hagolah, v'she'atid le'asov. These four altars, the one that Moses made, even though he didn't necessarily make it, but Salel did, or Eliyav, the one that Solomon made, and that those who returned from the Babylonian exile made, and the one that will be made. Kulan eser amoth gova kol echad mehen. Each one of them had a total height of 10 amoth. We saw previously, for our intents and purposes, an amah is 6 tefachim. Each tefach is 8 centimeters. 8 times 6 is 48 centimeters. So each amah, each tefach is 8 centimeters. Each amah is 6 tefachim. So each amah would be 48 centimeters, which is just less than half a meter, or about 1.5 feet. And he's saying that each of these altars had a total height of 10 amoth, which would make it 4.8 meters in height, or 10 times 1.5 would be about 15 feet in height. That is the top surface of the altar. But we're going to see that includes the height of the horns, which were these protrusions, box-like protrusions at the four corners of the top of the altar. We'll see a picture of that soon. And that's surprising because if you read what's here, like Rambam says, you read the book of Exodus, it seems that they were told to make a mizbeach which is 3 amos tall. And indeed, there's a whole discussion in the Talmud, in Zvachim, if I'm not mistaken. There are some of the sages who actually accepted this and said, no, the temple, the altar in the Mishkan actually was of a height of 3 amoth. And the halacha follows, apparently. The opinion says, no, it means 3 amoth, mekom hamaracha bilvad. It's 3 amas is the part where they actually had the fire going and where the wood was arranged and where the sacrifice actually took place. But the actual height of the structure was 10 amoth in total. And there's some interesting pictures. I have them in the book here. Actually, you could see the Art Scroll has it. They have some good pictures in their Gemara. Our Gemaras don't have it, so you have to use an Art Scroll for that. See, behind us they happen to have Art Scrolls. I prefer, like I said, if I'm looking in one of these for the visual aids, also I happen to prefer the Koranes, which are on this side over here. That's my own personal preference. So he's saying that when it says the altar at a height of 3 amos, that is actually talking about the only specific part of the altar. And this altar that the returnees from Babylon built, and the one that will be built, midat or kovarochbo, its length and width from the bird's eye view, that is on the ground, how much space does it take? Shloshim u'shtayim amoth al shloshim u'shtayim. It's 32 amoth by 32 amoth, which is once again 32 times 32 half meters or so, or 16 meters by 16 meters. 32 times 1.5 is 48 feet. 48, good number, because we already said that it's each amma itself is 48 centimeters, but now it's 48 feet. So just sitting at the base of the altar and not including the ramp that's in the altar's south, that's how you get to the top of it. The very base of the altar takes up a space of 48 by 48 feet, which is huge. It might be as big as this room I'm sitting in here. So it's kind of a hard thing to miss. People are wondering, where is the place on the Temple Mount where the altar is supposed to sit? Just to know, if you had a smaller altar like they did in the Second Temple times, or if you had no other choice but to build a smaller altar, like has been pointed out by Rav Lior and others, and Rabbi Ariel, when they built a makeshift altar, they're ready to go if they could just put it where it belongs. So there's a huge space to do it. This is a 32 by 32 amas. Is like it's like they talk about shechting a giraffe. There's a bubba mice out there that we don't know where to shecht a giraffe, and that's not true. Actually, a giraffe is the easiest animal to shecht in terms of where you can shecht it, because it has such a long neck. If you can't find where to shecht the giraffe, where to make the incision, then you can't hit the broadside of a barn with a baseball. So too, the actual place of the temple on the Temple Mount where the Mizbeach is supposed to go, even if we will get into that argument of where exactly things were on the Temple Mount today, this is a huge area. The Choladeo, if you could find a place that even of those who are disagreeing is slightly to the right or to the left, whatever it is, this is a very large area. It's very hard to miss. Eser amot shel gova mizbeach mehen ba'ama bat chamishat tefachim mehen ba'ama bat shishat tefachim. Another caveat when we discussed this altar, I said it's 10 amas tall. Normally, an amma is 6 tefachim. He says, but some of the ammas are 5 tefachim, which means that it's really a total of 10 ammas minus some tefachim. There's going to be 2 ammas that are actually made of just 5 tefachim, which means it's not a total of 10 times 6 tefachim, or 60 tefachim total in height. It's going to be 60 tefachim minus 2, which is 58 tefachim. Ushar kol amot habinyan, he says here, bat shishat tefachim. Every other amma that we have in the construction of the temple, we're talking about a 6 tefach amma, 48 centimeters total. If you'd have a 5 tefach amma, it would only be 40 centimeters. If we're assuming, like I said, a 8 centimeter tefach. It's only with regards to the construction of the altar that we have this phenomenon that some of the amoth are missing a tefach. They're missing a 1/6 of their total length. The total height of the mizbeach is really 58 tefachs. So he's basically saying two of these tefachs are deficient. Now here is how it was actually built in its picture. For this online, this is what the Korean has here. So you see here, there's the first amma. The first amma is only 5 tefachs up, 5 tefachs up for one amma, and then an indent of another 5 tefachs, and that's called the base. And then we go up shloshim tefachim. That means another 5 ammas until we get to the next part. That's the sovev. That's the circular halfway point. And then there's another 18 tefachs there, which means 3 more tefachs for this next section. And then you have another, the height of the horns is that deficient amma, another 5 tefachs. So the deficient amma is the first amma, and the toppest amma, the one most on top, and the one all the way on the bottom. And the 8 ammas in the middle are all 6 tefach ammas for a total of 8 times 8 times 48. Let's say that's 320 plus another 64, 384 centimeters height. And there you have it. And I recommend also getting a nice picture on the computer. Hopefully we'll find one for everybody. But that's, like I said, maybe for a different time. Now let's continue in the text. It says here, Allah chamishim tefachim, chamisha tefachim, go up 5 tefachs. That means from the ground, basically, from the surface of the temple courtyard, 5 tefachs up. And then it's an indent of 5 tefachim. That means we're going to decrease the width and length. It's basically one brick, 32 by 32, with a height of 5 tefachs, 32 ammas by 32 ammas, height of 5 tefachs, and then recess, 5 tefachs in. And this is what's called the yesod. This is the base of the temple. Nimtza rochav shloshim amma u'shnei tefachim al rochav shloshim amma u'shnei tefachim. If we indent now, we have a recess of 5 tefachim. It means this new layer has only a total area of shloshim amma, 30 full ammas, and 2 tefachim left over, and the same for its width. Width and length is now 30 ammas and 2 tefachim. So we said 30 ammas, that's approximately 1.5 feet for every amma. Another 2 tefachs are 48 centimeters for every amma, 48 times 30, plus another 16 centimeters. Allah shloshim tefach, you go up another 30 tefachs, which is the equivalent of 5 ammas. Mechanas chamisha tefachim. And then another recess of 5 tefachim. Every time there's a recess, another 5 tefachim. And this layer, this level over here is called the sovev, the surrounding part of the altar. Nimtza rochbo shmona ve'esrim amma v'arba'at tefachim al shmona ve'esrim amma v'arba'at tefachim. The area from the bird's eye view of this new block is a total of esrim amma and 4 tefachs. Shmona ve'esrim, 28 ammas and 4 tefachs, and by 28 ammas and 4 tefachs, which, and once again, every one of these ammas is 48 centimeters, plus another 4 tefachs, which would be another 32 centimeters. Umakom akranoth, amamizeh saviv. The area of each of these horns is an amma and by an amma. That's what these horns take up. Each one of them, from the bird's eye view, they take up an area of 1 amma by 1 amma. The area set aside for the kohanim to be able to walk. That means that if you would look at the top surface of the altar, you already lose that perimeter, which has a width of 5 tefachs, which is this deficient amma. And then the kohanim need also a perimeter that's 1 amma wide. And nimtza makom hamaracha, which means that the remaining area on top of the altar, where they would actually have the fires going, rochav arba ve'esrim amma, has a width of 24 ammas and 4 tefachim v'arba tefachim. Al arba ve'esrim amma v'arba tefachim. Square was 24 ammas and another 4 tefachim. That's actually still quite large. And they actually derive this there in the Gemara. And it says it should be 12 by 12. And they say, no, it's 12 by 12 in every direction. That is, if you start from the center, you can go 12 in that direction, 12 in that direction, which means you have a box that's 24 by 24. That's how the Gemara concludes. Hold on one second. I think people are sending us messages. Once again, if there's someone else who's webmastering and joining us online, they could tell me if they see questions in the chat. Let me see here. Okay, no, it's not about this particular thing, so we're going to skip it. Gova kol karen v'karen chamishat tfachim. The height of every karen also was 5 tfachim. That's 5 times 8 centimeters. V'ribua kol karen, and it's square. Ama al ama. It's 4 by 4. V'arba kranot chalulot hein mitochan. These 4 kranot they were made hollow on the inside. V'gova makom maracha shmona asar tefach. The height of the place of this maracha was 18 tefachs. You could actually take a look at this shmona asar tefachim. I said here, the makom maracha, 18 tefach. Once you said that's 3 amos, because each tefach is 6 tefachim, and that's the 3 amos as described in the construction according to the plan in Exodus. And that's how he accounts for it. The makom maracha is that top layer above the sovev of the mizbeach. And that actually makes it, if you kind of think about this, there was no guardrails going up the ramp to the altar. At least the altar itself is wide. You have 24 by 24 tefachs on top. So if you stay away from the edges, you should be safe. And actually, the Gemara does have an instance where there were Kohanim were apparently misbehaving. It says they cared too much about technical things. It did cause injury. There are people who did fall off. And you think about also the original altar built in the Mishkan was much more narrow. It had significantly less length and width, but the same height, according to this halacha. So that was pretty dangerous. Apparently, they definitely wouldn't go run up there. I can't imagine how even one Kohen would get up there, let alone 2 Kohanim. So I guess it was only 1 Kohen at a time. But that's history. Anyways, it's not going to be anyways. Nimtza chatzi gova mizbeach b'shishat tefachim misof hasovev ulamata. Halfway up the mizbeach, which would be a total of 5 tefachs, 5 amas up. Then again, 4 actual amas and 1 deficient amma, ends up 6 tefachim below the sovev. Over here in this picture again, it would be if this is where the sovev starts, so it's 6 tefachim below is the midway point of the mizbeach. So there's 1 amma of the yisod, 1 deficient amma, plus another 4 tefachim up in the main structure of the altar over here. So that would be halfway up would be 5 tefachs plus another 15 tefachs. 5 plus 15 is 20 tefachs up to the top, which would give us a total height of 20 times 8 centimeters is 1.6 meters. No, I'm getting something wrong here. 5 tefachs plus another 15 tefachs. 20 tefachim times 20. Yeah, I guess that's how it would work out. So that's the halfway point. Why is it important that we know the halfway point? It's basically here you have, once again, shloshim tefachim. Why is this important? Because you have to know that halfway point of the mizbeach. Rambam says here, chatzi gova mizbeach b'shat tefachim misof hasovev ulamata v'chut shel sikra hayah chagur be'emtza mizbeach. There was a red line. Chagur is like wrapped around it like a belt around this mizbeach. Lavdil bein damin ha'elyonim l'damin ha'tachtonim. Here's the important part: to make a divider between the lower bloods and the upper bloods and lower bloods. Certain sacrifices had to have their blood applied above this red line, and certain sacrifices below this red line. This is something I've always wondered about. We're going to have to see. He's alluding to halacha that we have not seen yet. God willing, we'll be able to see those also. I'd like to see this. How high is the mizbeach in total? It says here, shloshim tefachim. So no, they got that. It would be actually a height of, it says here, nimsa chasim b'shishat tefachim misof hasovev ulamata, which means it was 24 tefachim plus another 5 tefachim, which is 29 tefachim. 29 tefachim times 8 centimeters, 29 Well, times 8 is 160 centimeters plus another 72 for 232 centimeters. So it's 2 meters, 2.32 meters above the ground. That's the halfway point, which is actually quite high. A Kohen, even the tallest men, most people don't get to 2 meters tall. But this Sovev line, this Chuda Sikra, which is below the Sovev, is 2.3 meters above the ground. So it's quite a feat that a Kohen who has to apply the blood, there was ways for him to get higher than that. He doesn't have to jump up there. We're going to see how he applies the blood above that line. Next. Yesod HaMizbeach, hold on 1 second. Yeah. The area above from the ground until you get to the place of the Maracha is 9 amoth less a tefach. The Zoe Tsurato, the Fimidotav, and the Machon Mamre is nice enough to show you that they took out the Shiur. Perhaps Maimonides in his own handwriting had written this, certainly the Perusha Mishnayot, and in some editions, Rambam included his own pictures. I do not know why specifically Machon Mamre left out the pictures. I would have liked it, but you could find them online. It's well known that Maimonides is, for example, his schematic of the menorah in the Perusha Mishnayot is well known, and other illustrations that he did are still in our possession, and his signature also. All these things are part of widespread knowledge. Yesod HaMizbeach lo makif mi'arba ruchotav k'mo sovev. Now, remember, he said the Yesod is 32 by 32, but it didn't take up all of its space. There was a blank space. It says they filled it in with wood there when they were pouring the concrete, but it wasn't there on all sides. Very interesting. Here's a picture that they included here also. See, the Yesod didn't completely wrap around. It was just missing. It's as though it had been 32 by 32, but then they cut it off. If you were looking from, let's say, the west or the north, it looks like it's 32 by 32. But if you're looking from the south and from the east or from the southeast corner, you only see the Sovev go up to a certain point, and it's basically missing there. There's a whole, almost an amma missing from the base, so it's actually just 31 by 31. Elohaya Esod Mashuch Connected Kol Ruach Safuna Ma'arav L'Chol Darom Amma Achad V'Mizrach Amma Achad. The Karen Dromit Mezachit Lo Haya Lo Yesod. Here they show difference, opinion between Rashi and the Rambam, how the Yesod just came up to a certain point over there on the east side and on the south side. But basically, it meant that it's missing an amma on each of those sides. So it looks like a square 32 by 32 on one side, but a square of 31 by 31 on the other side. And that area, there just wasn't Yesod there. Very interesting why it is. Also, the Talmud discusses this. Of Keren Ma'aravit Ramit, at the southwest corner, Hayu Shnei Nekavim Kamin Shnei Chotmim Dakin. At the southwest corner, there was 2 holes. It looks like 2 nostrils, basically. Vehina Nikrin Shitin. They are called the, for lack of a better word, that's a proper it's a proper noun, but that's the pipes that go to the depths. Shadamim Yordin Bahem Umitarvim Ba'ama Yotzin Lanachal Kidron. At this southwest corner, don't forget the southwest corner is basically where the ramp was at the south, and the west is where the actual temple building was, the edifice, the Heichal. So at the place that at the convergence of those points, that's where they would spill the blood, and they would actually mix into the Amma. Amma was a channel of water that was channeled, for lack of a better word, through the courtyard. The water was brought through the miracles of hydrodynamic engineering. They were brought from a higher place in Jerusalem, from Ein Tam. And before they had modern plumbing, this is how they did it. You could see ancient Roman-style aqueducts. They had a constant flow of water going through the courtyard, and they used it to clean the courtyard. And also, this is where the blood that was spilled at the altar would get washed away through this channel. V'yotzin l'nachal Kidron. They go into the Kidron Valley, the Wadi, which is outside of the old city. Hold on, keep getting these things, but none of these are about our questions here. Someone have a question, Binyamin? Maybe you see someone there sending me a message. No, okay, we're going to continue. So that's where they had there. That's where the blood would flow out. Ulamata baritz pub ota karen, and underneath the floor there, on the floor at that same corner southwest, hayam mekum ama alama. There was a one amma by one amma place with tavlashel shayith with tabath kivuaba. It was a trap door. It wasn't the floor of the altar of the courtyard there had uh, basically a balata that was loose. That was its place. It was actually removable. It had a ring there, so you could actually lift it up. It was like basically like a manhole. Shabo yordim lashayit or lashit umanakinoto. They would go down to this depth, to this chamber below. That's where the blood would flow, and they would clean it with zoe tsuratho, and also that was left out. So you could see that this is a place where they would clean it out there. It's literally a manhole because a man had to go down there and clean it every now and then. So they'd say once every 7 years, once every 7 years. Obviously, those are exaggerated numbers. It wasn't a frequent thing. Chevesh, once again, that's a ramp. There was a ramp to the south of the altar, or kosh loshimushtayim. It had a width of 32 amot, like the base of the altar. Al ruchav sheshesrei amma, and had a length of 6 amos. Vayolchil ba'aretz toshim amma mitzadam mizbeach. On the ground, it was 30 amos long. Remember, he's describing what's basically a right triangle which has a height of about 10, and on its base is 30 amos. Because it was basically adjoining the actual altar, which we said recessed as it got to the top. This is the third illustration you can see over there. It's actually, see, it gets wider at the top, so it could basically it could hug the mizbeach, even though there was a gap between it and the mizbeach. So this thing was 30 amos by about 10 amos, and they said it has a 32 amos on top. It has a length of 32. You can do some basic calculations. That's not the way it works out according to the Pythagorean theorem. It's actually a little bit less. Chazal weren't exact with these things, as there's a few sugyas and shas, for example, where they estimate pi is basically 3. There's a few Gemaras there in Eruvin and Sukkah about that. And in Shabbos also, they assume that the square root of 2, when you're trying to figure out the diagonal of a square one by one, so they say it's 1.4 or 1 2/5. And really, it's not exactly that, but it's close enough. In this case, it's not 32 amos. It should be like 31.67722 660, something like that. There's a 6, yeah, I think it's 31.67722 to like 8 decimal places. So 32 is a close enough approximation. Next, there was another 2 smaller ramps. Sorry, over here. We skipped this over here. Okay, you had to adjoin the mizbeach even where it was indented there. There was a slight gap. It wasn't flush against the altar. Why? Because the Kohanim are commanded to throw the Avarim. They have to take these sacrificial parts and throw them from the ramp onto the top surface of the altar where the fires are going. So in order for it to be considered a throw, they have to be separate from the Mizbeach itself. So there was this gap in between them, very slight gap, which is insignificant for our calculations. The Gova Kevesh Tesha Amoth Pachot Shtut. The height of this thing, the ramp was actually 9 amos less a sixth. Ad Keneged Hamaracha, because they had to get all the way to the top of the Maracha. So once again, you calculate that now, still you get less than 32 amos over here. The ramp had 2 more other smaller ramps that would branch off from it. They were separated from the main ramp. They were separated from the altar by about a hair's breadth. And you could use these smaller ramps to get to the Yesod and to the Sovev. And once again, there's a picture over here. They show this smaller ramp that goes up alongside the main ramp, but eventually branches off to the Sovev. which is about just more than halfway up the height of Mizbeach. And on the other side, there's a smaller ramp that goes back down to the Yesod. Why? Because if the Kohen was coming down this way, he'd be far away from the Yesod. But in this case, he can come down and then go this way and get closer to the Yesod. I guess it saves time, and also the sages saw that that's proper. These are not described. These other ramps are not described in Exodus, and they're only alluded to in other biblical sources. They're not explicit in the biblical sources, but the sages knew that this is the way it is supposed to be built. That's also a positive halachic tradition. Next thing. V'chalon hayta b'ma'aravo shel kevesh, ama al ama. It was also this window was on the west side of the altar. It's not a window; it's more like an indentation, like a window sill, but it wasn't a window that could look clear through the kevesh. It was just an indentation there. Urvuva hayta nikret. It was called the rivuva. Sheba nothnim pesulei chatath va'oth. That's where they put the disqualified sin offerings, bird sin offerings. Remember, a bird is normally sometimes sin offerings can be quite a large behemoth, but sometimes they're just a single pigeon or turtle dove, which are quite small, by the way. And these ones are disqualified. They couldn't just dispose of them. They had to leave them in that place until they were fully deformed. They were no longer recognizable. So that's where he'd put them. Ad shetav or tzurata. This chatath was placed there just for waiting until it was until they had no prohibition to remove it from the temple courtyard. With Teitzei Leveit HaSrifa, and then they would bring it out to the Beit HaSrifa, which was the place where they would always burn the usual sacrifices that had been disqualified. They couldn't be burned on the altar, they couldn't be eaten, they couldn't be just thrown out, chas v'shalom. So there was a specific place where they'd burn all these disqualified offerings. There was two tables there to the west of the kevesh that was between the ramp and once again the temple structure. One was made out of marble. Shnothim allow with ha'evarim. There they put the limbs that were waiting to go onto the altar. Kesef, and one of silver. Shnothim allow klei hasharet. They put the service vessels there. It says here, Chazal explained that the Avarim were put on this marble table because marble is generally cool. They said even for the small amount of time, the few minutes where they're actually leaving the Avarim there, sometimes it's a sunny day, it's warm, you don't want them even to begin to spoil. You want to avoid that entirely. Marble had a generally colder feel to it. Kesef, which is a type of metal, silver, that would apparently heat up more quickly in the sun and cause the Avarim, the parts of the disjointed sacrifice. I'm forgetting my words now, but they would take apart the sacrifice. We're going to see this. They have the head, the arms, the legs, etc. These were all things that they would give to, let's say, in the Korban Tamid, they'd give to different Kohanim the privilege of bringing those up onto the altar. So there were quite a few of these things. They had to be kept in a place that would reduce, in any way possible, the chance that these things would go bad. That's all the time we have for now. The clock is wrong, so we're going to have to finish these halachot maybe sometimes this week, or we'll just pick it up there next Mosei Shabbat. Before we go, any questions, comments? We're going to stop the sharing here. And I don't see, oh, here we go. Is there a chat here? Oh yeah, let's see in the chat. I don't see it. Why is it not here? I guess that's it. There's no question here.
I don't see any questions there.
It says that there's a message. Oh, you send me no messages. There you go. And the WhatsApp thing is not related, so we're gonna deal with that this week. Okay, have a good week. See you next time, and God willing, by the time we meet again, we're gonna have questions about how this was done and not how this should be. Be well.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.